The letter in Abigail Winters' trembling hands had promised a life of security and comfort as the wife of a prosperous Montana rancher. Instead, she stood before an abandoned homestead, her trunk of meager possessions at her feet, as the driver, who delivered her, disappeared down the dusty road without a backward glance. 3,000 miles from Boston, with nothing but $20 to her name and a wedding band that belonged to no marriage. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The September wind whipped across the Montana plains, catching Abigail's honey-blonde hair and sending it dancing around her face. She pulled her threadbare coat tighter, fighting back tears as she surveyed the weathered two-story farmhouse. Broken windows gaped like missing teeth, the front porch sagged dangerously to one side, and the barn beyond stood with its doors hanging askew, as if the entire property had been frozen in the moment of abandonment. "Mr. Sullivan," she called, her voice thin against the vast emptiness surrounding her. "Nathan Sullivan." Only the whistling wind answered, carrying with it the scent of pine and approaching autumn. Abigail swallowed hard, forcing down the panic rising in her throat. The advertisement had been specific. Successful cattle rancher seeks bride of good character and practical disposition. Comfortable home, honest living, and respectful treatment guaranteed. She had corresponded with Nathan Sullivan for 6 months before scraping together her last pennies for the train fare west. His letters had been thoughtful, sometimes even poetic, describing a prosperous ranch with a house waiting for a woman's touch. He had not mentioned that the house would be empty, practically falling down around her ears. Abigail squared her shoulders. At 26, with no family and few prospects, she had made this desperate gamble for a reason. The textile mill where she'd worked for 8 years had closed suddenly, leaving her with nothing but the skills of a spinster: sewing, cooking, basic arithmetic, and the growing awareness that Boston held nothing for her but hardship and loneliness. She had not come all this way to be defeated by an empty house and a missing bridegroom. With determined steps, Abigail dragged her trunk up the 3 broken porch stairs and pushed open the front door. Inside, dust motes danced in the shafts of afternoon sunlight streaming through dirty windows. The furniture was sparse but solid: a oak table with 4 chairs, a stone fireplace with an iron pot hanging above cold ashes, a rocking chair with a faded quilt thrown over its back. It looked as though someone had walked out one day and simply never returned. Abigail set her trunk down and moved deeper into the house, running her fingers along the mantel and leaving tracks in the thick dust. The kitchen held a cast iron stove, several empty cupboards, and a water pump that, to her relief, still worked after several vigorous attempts. Upstairs, she found 2 bedrooms. One with a large bed still made up with linens gone yellow with age, the other completely empty, save for a wooden chair in the corner. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. No sign of Nathan Sullivan, no indication of why he had abandoned this place or when he might return. Night was approaching, and Abigail had no choice but to make the best of her situation. She had packed provisions for the journey: hard bread, dried apples, and jerky, enough for a few days if she rationed carefully. She found a half-filled kerosene lamp and matches in a kitchen drawer. After lighting the lamp and the stove, she swept away the worst of the dust from the kitchen floor and table, her mind spinning with questions and growing anger. Had Nathan Sullivan ever existed? Had she been the victim of some elaborate hoax? Or had something happened to the man whose letters she had carried next to her heart for months? As darkness fell completely, Abigail sat at the kitchen table, a cup of water before her, staring at the flame of the lamp. She was contemplating whether to sleep in the dusty bed upstairs or make a pallet on the kitchen floor when the sound of approaching hoofbeats broke the silence. Her heart leapt to her throat. Was this Nathan finally arriving to explain his absence, or was it someone else entirely, perhaps with less honourable intentions toward a woman alone in an isolated farmhouse? Abigail grabbed the iron poker from beside the stove and positioned herself behind the door, her breath coming in short, panicked bursts. The hoofbeats stopped outside, heavy boots crossed the porch, then a knock, 3 firm raps that seemed to echo through the empty house. "Hello," a deep voice called. "Is someone in there? I saw the light." It wasn't a voice Abigail recognized from the station master's descriptions of Nathan Sullivan. This voice was deeper, rougher somehow, like stones rolling down a mountainside. "Who are you?" she called, gripping the poker tighter. "What do you want?" A pause, then, "Name's Caleb Morgan. I own the neighboring ranch. This place has been empty for almost a year. Saw the light and thought I should investigate." Abigail hesitated, then carefully opened the door a crack, keeping the poker visible. In the silver moonlight stood a tall man, broad-shouldered and imposing. His face was partially hidden by the shadow of his hat, but she could make out a strong jaw, darkened with stubble, and eyes that seemed to catch the moonlight. "I'm Abigail Winters," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I came from Boston to marry Nathan Sullivan. He was supposed to meet me at the station, but he wasn't there." The man, Caleb Morgan, went very still. Then he removed his hat, revealing dark hair shot through with threads of silver at the temples. His face was weathered by sun and wind, with lines at the corners of his eyes that spoke of squinting into distances. Those eyes, now visible in the lamplight spilling from the door, were a startling blue, the color of a summer sky just before storm clouds gather. "Miss Winters," he said slowly, "I think you'd better let me come in. There are some things you need to know about Nathan Sullivan." Something in his tone sent a chill down Abigail's spine. She stepped back, allowing him to enter, but kept the poker firmly in her grasp. Caleb Morgan seemed to fill the small kitchen with his presence. He moved with the careful precision of a man accustomed to managing his own strength, placing his hat on the table and keeping his distance, as if aware of how intimidating he might appear. "Nathan Sullivan died last winter," he said without preamble. "Pneumonia took him quick. I helped bury him myself, out behind the apple orchard." The poker slipped from Abigail's fingers and clattered to the floor. She groped blindly for the edge of the table, suddenly lightheaded. "But that's impossible," she whispered. "I received a letter from him just 3 weeks ago. The final arrangements for my journey." Caleb Morgan's expression darkened. "That wasn't Sullivan. Someone's been using his name, and I think I know who." He pulled out a chair. "You'd better sit down, Miss Winters. This is a complicated story." Abigail sank into the chair, her mind reeling. "If Nathan Sullivan is dead, then who have I been corresponding with? Who arranged for my passage here?" "A man named Vernon Caldwell," Caleb said, his voice hardening. "He was Sullivan's business partner. When Nathan died without any family, Caldwell laid claim to half the ranch. But there was a problem with the deed. It specifically stated that Sullivan's share would pass to his widow, should he ever marry." Understanding began to dawn, cold and sickening. "So this Caldwell has been writing to me, pretending to be Nathan Sullivan, intending to—" She couldn't finish the sentence. "Intending to legally secure Sullivan's half of the property through you," Caleb confirmed grimly. "Caldwell's not the marrying kind. My guess is he planned to go through with a wedding ceremony, get you to sign some documents, and then find a way to be rid of you. He's been in Denver for the past month on business. Must not have gotten word you were arriving today." Abigail felt as though the floor were tilting beneath her. She had spent her last dollars coming to marry a dead man, lured by someone with sinister intentions. She was alone, nearly penniless, in a territory where she knew no one. Caleb Morgan seemed to read her thoughts. "You can't stay here," he said firmly. "Caldwell could return any day. I have a ranch hand's cabin on my property that's sitting empty. You'd be safe there while you figure out your next steps." Abigail stiffened. She had just learned that one man had deceived her with false promises. Why should she trust another stranger, especially one who was offering to take her to his property? "How do I know I can trust you, Mr. Morgan?" she asked, lifting her chin. "For all I know, you could be this Vernon Caldwell, spinning tales, to get me to go with you willingly." A ghost of a smile touched Caleb's lips, softening the hard planes of his face for just a moment. "Fair question. The station master knows me, Sam Tucker, and Sheriff Mason in town can vouch for me. I've been running the Circle M ranch for 15 years, ever since my father passed. I'm not in the habit of abducting women, Miss Winters. Nevertheless, I think I'll take my chances here tonight," Abigail said, though the thought of staying alone in the abandoned house filled her with dread. "In the morning, I'll go into town and speak with this Sheriff Mason myself." Caleb studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "As you wish. But Caldwell has men who ride for him, rough sorts who wouldn't think twice about forcing themselves on a woman alone. If you insist on staying, I'll keep watch outside tonight." "That won't be necessary," Abigail began, but Caleb was already moving toward the door. "It is necessary," he said, his tone brooking no argument. "I'll be on the porch. Bar this door behind me, and don't open it for anyone but me come morning." Before she could protest further, he was gone, the door closing firmly behind him. Abigail hesitated only a moment before sliding the heavy wooden bar into place. Whatever Caleb Morgan's true intentions, having someone standing guard outside was better than facing the night alone. Sleep came in fitful bursts, with Abigail jerking awake at every creak of the old house settling and every gust of wind rattling the loose window panes. She had made a pallet near the stove with her cloak and the faded quilt from the rocking chair, keeping the poker close at hand, despite Caleb's presence outside. As dawn approached, exhaustion finally pulled her into deeper sleep. She awoke to the smell of coffee and the sound of quiet movement in the kitchen. Bolting upright, she found Caleb Morgan standing at the stove, his back to her as he tended to a pot of something that smelled tantalizingly like oatmeal. Light streamed through the windows, revealing a kitchen that looked markedly cleaner than it had the night before. "You said not to open the door for anyone but you," Abigail said accusingly, scrambling to her feet. "You didn't say anything about letting yourself in while I slept." Caleb turned, an apologetic expression on his face. "You were sleeping so soundly I didn't want to wake you. The bar on the door was rotted through, barely held when I leaned on it. Wouldn't have kept out a determined child, let alone Caldwell's men." He nodded toward a plate on the table. "I brought provisions. Figured you might be hungry." Abigail wanted to maintain her indignation, but the sight of fresh bread, a small crock of butter, and what appeared to be raspberry preserves made her stomach growl audibly. She hadn't eaten a proper meal since leaving the train yesterday. "Thank you," she said stiffly, taking a seat at the table. "But I still intend to go into town and verify your story." "Already sent one of my men to fetch Sheriff Mason," Caleb replied, pouring coffee into a chipped mug and placing it before her. "He should be here within the hour. In the meantime, I've been thinking about your situation." Abigail spread a thin layer of butter and preserves on a slice of bread, trying not to appear too eager as she took a bite. The sweetness of the berries burst across her tongue, making her realize just how hungry she truly was. "And what conclusions have you reached about my situation, Mr. Morgan?" she asked once she had swallowed. Caleb leaned against the counter, cradling his own mug of coffee. In the daylight, she could see him more clearly, The strong lines of his face, the way his blue eyes seemed to hold shadows despite the brightness of the morning, the slight limp in his gait that she hadn't noticed the night before. "You have 3 options as I see it," he said pragmatically. "First, you could return east, though I gather from what you've said that there's not much waiting for you there." Abigail nodded reluctantly. Going back to Boston would mean admitting defeat, facing destitution, perhaps even being forced into the poorhouse. She had sold most of her possessions to purchase her train ticket. "Second," Caleb continued, "you could stay in town. There's a boarding house for respectable women. Mrs. Holloway, who runs it, might be able to help you find work, though positions for single women are limited in these parts." The prospect was slightly more appealing than returning east, but not by much. Abigail had come west seeking a home of her own, not another room in another boarding house with another set of strict rules governing her behavior. "And the third option?" she prompted when Caleb fell silent. He took a long sip of his coffee before answering. "You could stay at my ranch, work as my housekeeper. I've been without one since Mrs. Jenkins left to care for her daughter's new baby 3 months ago. The house is falling into disarray, and I take most of my meals with the ranch hands because I can't cook worth a damn." A faint flush colored his cheekbones at the crude language. "Pardon my French." Abigail considered the offer, trying to determine if there was some hidden motive. And where would I stay in this arrangement? Mrs. Jenkins had rooms in the main house, a bedroom and sitting room of her own with a separate entrance. "You'd have privacy in your own space. I'd pay you a fair wage, and you'd take your meals with the family." "The family?" Abigail asked, surprised. "You're married, Mr. Morgan." A shadow passed over Caleb's face. "No, it's just me and my sister, Rebecca. She's 16 now. Been trying to manage the household affairs since Mrs. Jenkins left, but she's more interested in horses than housekeeping. Truth be told, she needs a woman's influence. Our mother died when she was just a baby." The arrangement had a certain appeal. Abigail would have a roof over her head, meaningful work, and the chance to build up some savings while she determined her next steps. Still, caution held her back. "Why would you offer such a position to a complete stranger?" she asked. "For all you know, I could be a terrible housekeeper or have some nefarious purpose of my own." The ghost of a smile touched Caleb's lips again. "You strike me as a practical woman, Miss Winters, not the type to journey across the country without at least knowing how to keep a decent house. As for your character, well, I consider myself a fair judge. You didn't faint or dissolve into hysterics when I told you about Sullivan, and you had the good sense to question my motives. Those are points in your favor." Before Abigail could respond, the sound of approaching horses drew their attention. Caleb moved to the window, his posture tensing slightly before relaxing. "It's Sheriff Mason," he said. "And it looks like he's brought Mrs. Holloway from the boarding house with him." The arrival of these respectable town citizens helped ease some of Abigail's concerns. Sheriff Mason, a stocky man with a grey mustache and kind eyes, confirmed everything Caleb had told her about Nathan Sullivan's death and Vernon Caldwell's dubious character. Mrs. Holloway, a bustling woman in her 50s, expressed outrage at Abigail's situation and offered her a place at the boarding house for a modest fee, of course. When Caleb mentioned his offer of employment, Mrs. Holloway gave him a sharp look. "Caleb Morgan, are you finally hiring a proper housekeeper? The state of your home when I visited Rebecca last month was shameful. Dust thick enough to plant crops in." Caleb had the grace to look abashed. "That's why I'm offering Miss Winters the position. Rebecca tries, but that girl has her head in the clouds and her heart in the stables." Mrs. Holloway finished for him. "Been that way since she could walk." She turned to Abigail. "The Morgan Ranch is one of the finest in the territory, and Caleb here is as honorable as they come, despite his tendency to forget basic civilities like regular invitations to supper for his neighbors." The sheriff nodded in agreement. "I'd trust Caleb Morgan with my life. have done, in fact, during that blizzard of '83. Their endorsements went a long way toward easing Abigail's mind, but she still hesitated. "What about my trunk, my belongings?" "Already loaded it onto my wagon," Caleb said. "Whether you choose the boarding house or my offer, you can't stay here. Caldwell's due back any day." Decision time. Abigail looked around the abandoned farmhouse that had so briefly represented her hopes for a new life. There was nothing for her here but deception and danger. The boarding house would be safe, but offered little opportunity for advancement. The position at the Morgan Ranch, however, could be a fresh start, a chance to establish herself in this new territory with the protection of a respected name behind her. "I accept your offer of employment, Mr. Morgan," she said finally. "On a trial basis, 1 month after which either of us can terminate the arrangement if it's not satisfactory." Caleb nodded, something like relief flickering across his features. "That seems fair. We can discuss terms on the ride to the ranch." As they prepared to leave, Sheriff Mason took Caleb aside for a private word. Abigail couldn't hear what was said, but she noticed the grim set of Caleb's jaw and the concerned glances both men cast in her direction. "Is there something I should know?" she asked when the sheriff had departed, and Mrs. Holloway had returned to town with promises to visit soon. Caleb hesitated, then sighed. "Mason thinks Caldwell might not take kindly to finding you've slipped through his fingers. The man's not known for his forgiving nature." A chill ran down Abigail's spine. "You think he might come after me?" "I think he's invested too much in his scheme to let it go easily," Caleb said carefully. "But you'll be safe at Circle M. My men are loyal, and Caldwell knows better than to trespass on my land." The confidence in his voice was reassuring. But as they set off toward the Morgan Ranch, Abigail couldn't shake the feeling that she had exchanged one precarious situation for another. She had come west, seeking security, and instead found herself caught in a web of deception, property disputes, and potential danger. Yet as the wagon crested a hill and the Circle M ranch came into view, Abigail felt a stirring of hope. Unlike the abandoned Sullivan property, this was a working ranch in its prime. A large 2-story house of hewn logs and river stone stood proudly at the center, surrounded by well-maintained outbuildings, corrals filled with horses, and vast pastures dotted with cattle. Smoke rose cheerfully from the chimney, and flower boxes brightened the windows despite the approaching autumn. "It's beautiful," she murmured, almost to herself. Caleb glanced at her, a flicker of pride crossing his face. "My father built it from nothing. Started with 50 acres and 10 head of cattle. Now we're running over 5,000 head on 20,000 acres. He paused, then added more quietly, "It's a good place to build a life." As they approached the house, the front door burst open and a young girl, no, a young woman, Abigail, corrected herself, came flying down the steps. Rebecca Morgan was tall and coltish, with her brother's dark hair flowing loose down her back and the same startling blue eyes, though hers held none of the shadows that haunted Caleb's. "You've been gone all night," she exclaimed, then stopped short at the sight of Abigail. "Who's this?" "Rebecca, mind your manners," Caleb admonished, though there was no real heat in his words. "This is Miss Abigail Winters. She's going to be our new housekeeper." Rebecca's face lit up. "Really? Thank goodness. I'm terrible at it, you know. I tried to make biscuits yesterday, and they were so hard. Caleb said we could use them for ammunition if the Blackfoot ever decided to raid again." She thrust out her hand to Abigail. "I'm Rebecca. Everyone calls me Becca except Caleb when he's being stuffy." Abigail couldn't help but smile as she shook the girl's hand. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Becca. I hope my biscuits will be somewhat more edible." "They couldn't possibly be worse," Caleb muttered, helping Abigail down from the wagon. As they entered the house, Abigail began to understand Mrs. Holloway's comments about dust thick enough to plant crops. The Morgan home was solidly built and well furnished, with pieces that spoke of prosperity, but it was clear that housekeeping had taken a distant second place to ranch operations. Boots had tracked mud across the otherwise fine carpets. Dishes were stacked haphazardly in the kitchen, and every surface bore a fine layer of dust. "I tried," Becca said apologetically, following Abigail's gaze, "but there's always something more interesting to do than dust." "Like rescuing orphaned wolf pups," Caleb said with a sigh, "or breaking the wildest colt in the territory." "That colt is coming along nicely," Becca protested. "Whiskey Pete says he's never seen a better hand with horses." "Whiskey Pete would say the moon was made of cheese if it got him an extra paw," Caleb replied dryly, but there was affection in his voice as he ruffled his sister's hair. "Show Miss Winters to her rooms, Becca. I need to check on the north pasture fence." As Caleb departed, Becca led Abigail up a wide staircase to the second floor. "Mrs. Jenkins had these rooms," she said, opening a door to reveal a pleasant bedroom with adjoining sitting room. "They have their own entrance from that side staircase, so you can come and go without passing through the main house if you wish." The rooms were dusty but charming, with large windows that looked out over the mountains to the west. A four-poster bed with a faded quilt stood against one wall, while a writing desk occupied the space beneath the window. The sitting room held a comfortable-looking armchair, a small bookcase filled with well-worn volumes, and a rocking chair positioned to catch the afternoon sun. "It's lovely," Abigail said sincerely. "Once it's cleaned up a bit, it will be perfect." Caleb had these rooms built specially for Mrs. Jenkins when her rheumatism got too bad for her to manage the stairs easily, Becca explained. "He's good. Like that, always thinking of how to make things easier for people." Abigail nodded, filing away this information about her new employer. "How long have you and your brother lived here, Becca?" "All my life," the girl replied, perching on the edge of the bed. "I don't remember our mother. She died when I was 2. Caleb practically raised me, even though he was only 19 when father died 10 years ago." She hesitated, then added, "He gave up a lot to keep this ranch going and take care of me." What did he give up?" Abigail asked, curious about the shadows she had glimpsed in Caleb Morgan's eyes. Becca's normally animated face grew serious. "He was engaged once to Elizabeth Hayward. Her father owned the bank in town. They were supposed to marry the spring after father died, but then everything changed." Before Becca could elaborate, a bell sounded from somewhere below. "That's the dinner bell for the ranch hands," she explained, jumping up. "Caleb will expect us at the main table. You can freshen up here. There's water in the pitcher, though it's probably dusty like everything else. I'll come fetch you in 15 minutes. Left alone, Abigail took stock of her new surroundings. The rooms were larger and more comfortable than anything she'd had in Boston. With some cleaning and perhaps a few personal touches, they would make a pleasant home. For a while at least, she reminded herself that this was a temporary arrangement, a way station on her journey too. To what exactly? She had come west seeking marriage, security, a home of her own. Those dreams had been shattered by Nathan Sullivan's death and Vernon Caldwell's deception. Now she found herself in the position of housekeeper to a man who intrigued and unsettled her in equal measure, a man with his own mysteries and shadows. As she washed her face and tidied her travel-worn dress as best she could, Abigail wondered what secrets lay behind Caleb Morgan's guarded expression. What had happened to transform a young man in love into the solitary, self-contained rancher who had come to her rescue? And more importantly, what would happen when Vernon Caldwell discovered that his carefully laid plans had gone awry? Dinner at the Morgan Ranch was an education in Western hospitality. Despite the disarray of the house, the long table in the dining room was laden with substantial fare. Roast beef, potatoes, fresh bread, bought from town, Becca confided in a whisper, and an apple pie that, while somewhat lopsided, smelled divine. "Cook does the main meals," Caleb explained as they took their seats, "but he's got 20 ranch hands to feed in the bunkhouse. Hasn't got time for fancy fixings or keeping the house in order." Abigail nodded, taking in the practical arrangement. "I can certainly manage the household cooking as well as the cleaning, Mr. Morgan. It would be no trouble." "Call me Caleb," he said. "Mr. Morgan was my father, and we're not much for formality out here." The meal passed pleasantly, with Becca chattering about her horses, her plans to compete in the territory's fall fair, and her determination to convince her brother that she was old enough to attend the harvest dance in town. Caleb mostly listened, offering occasional comments or gentle corrections when his sister's enthusiasm outstripped the facts. Abigail found herself studying him when his attention was elsewhere. There was a tension in him, a watchfulness that never fully abated even in these relaxed domestic moments. He reminded her of the sheepdogs she had seen on farms outside Boston, always alert, always aware of potential threats to their charges. After dinner, as Abigail insisted on helping clear the table, despite Caleb's protests that she should rest after her journey, Becca disappeared to check on a new foal. Left alone with Caleb in the kitchen, Abigail finally voiced the question that had been troubling her since their departure from the Sullivan farm. "This man, Caldwell," she said quietly. "How dangerous is he, truly?" Caleb paused in the act of storing leftover bread in the pantry. For a moment, she thought he might offer reassurances or downplay the threat. Instead, he turned to face her directly. "Dangerous enough that I've doubled the night watch on the ranch and sent word to my men to be on the lookout for strangers," he said. "Caldwell's not the type to get his own hands dirty, but he employs men who have no such compunctions. If he discovers you're here, he might try to force you to go through with his plan." Abigail felt cold despite the warmth of the kitchen. "Perhaps I shouldn't stay here. I'm putting you and Becca at risk." "No," Caleb said firmly. "Circle M is the safest place for you. My men are loyal, and they know the territory better than Caldwell's hired guns. Besides," he added with a grim smile, "I've been waiting for an excuse to put Caldwell in his place for years. Man's been encroaching on small ranchers' water rights, intimidating homesteaders into selling cheap, and generally making himself a nuisance in these parts." The protectiveness in his voice was both reassuring and concerning. "I don't want to be the cause of violence," Abigail said. "Nor do I want violence," Caleb replied. "But I will protect what's mine." He seemed to realize how possessive the words sounded and quickly added, "My ranch, my sister, my employees. You're under my roof now, Miss Winters. That makes your safety my responsibility." There was something reassuring about his straightforward declaration, even as it highlighted the precariousness of her position. She was entirely dependent on this man she had known for less than a day, in a territory where she had no friends, no connections, and apparently at least one enemy. "I should start earning my keep tomorrow," Abigail said, changing the subject. "The house will need a thorough cleaning, and I'll need to take inventory of the pantry and linens." Caleb nodded, seeming relieved at the shift to practical matters. "Becca can show you around in the morning. I'll be riding out to check the herd, but I should be back by supper." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a ranch hand, a weathered man in his 50s who Caleb introduced as Whiskey Pete, the ranch foreman. "Riders coming in from the east," Pete reported, giving Abigail a respectful nod. 2 men moving fast. Caleb's expression hardened. Caldwell's men. "Don't recognize them, but they're asking after a woman matching Miss Winters' description," Say they're carrying a message from Nathan Sullivan. Abigail's heart sank. Word had reached Caldwell already. Tell them she's not here, Caleb said firmly. Send them on their way. Already did, Pete replied with a gap-toothed grin. Told. And we hadn't seen hide nor hair of any Eastern lady. They seemed mighty disappointed, said they'd check back tomorrow. They'll be back sooner than that, Caleb muttered. Pete, double the night watch and make sure everyone's armed. No one approaches the house without being challenged. As Pete departed with a respectful touch to his hat brim, Abigail found herself trembling. The danger suddenly felt very real, very immediate. Perhaps I should go to the boarding house in town after all, she suggested. If they're looking for me here. Town's the first place they'll look next, Caleb interrupted. And Mrs. Holloway's boarding house doesn't have 20 armed cowboys protecting it. He moved closer, his voice softening. I know you're scared, Miss Winters. You have every right to be. But I give you my word. No harm will come to you while you're under my roof. The conviction in his voice was impossible to doubt. Whatever shadows haunted Caleb Morgan's past, whatever secrets he carried, his determination to protect those in his care was absolute. Thank you, Abigail said simply. I'll try not to be a burden. Something flickered in Caleb's eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or a deeper emotion she couldn't identify. You're not a burden, he said quietly. This ranch it's been too quiet for too long. Having you here, even under these circumstances, might be good for all of us. Before Abigail could respond to this unexpected admission, Becca burst into the kitchen, cheeks flushed with excitement. The foal is standing. You should see him, Abigail. He's got the most perfect white star on his forehead. The moment between Abigail and Caleb dissolved, but as she allowed herself to be dragged to the stables by an enthusiastic Becca, Abigail found herself glancing back at the house. Caleb stood in the doorway, a tall, solitary figure framed by lantern light, watching them go with an expression that combined watchfulness, concern, and something that might almost have been longing. That night, as Abigail prepared for bed in her new rooms, she found herself drawn to the window. The Montana night was clear and cold, stars scattered like diamonds across the vast canvas of the sky. Lamplight glowed from the bunkhouse windows, and she could make out the silhouettes of men on horseback patrolling the perimeter of the ranch buildings, Caleb's men keeping watch. She thought of the man himself, of the contradictions she had observed in just one day. Caleb Morgan was hard yet gentle, reserved yet passionate about his land and his responsibilities. He carried himself like a man who had known loss, who expected little from life beyond the satisfaction of duties fulfilled. Yet there had been moments when he spoke of the ranch, when he teased his sister, when he looked at Abigail herself, when something else showed through the carefully maintained facade. Who was Caleb Morgan beneath the surface he presented to the world? What had happened to the young man who had once been engaged to Elizabeth Hayward? Why had he never married, never sought companionship beyond his sister and his ranch hands? And why did these questions occupy her thoughts so persistently when she should be focusing on the very real danger posed by Vernon Caldwell? As if summoned by her thoughts, a movement at the edge of the property caught her eye. A rider keeping to the shadows of the tree line that marked the eastern boundary of the ranch yard. The figure paused, as if studying the house, then melted back into the darkness. A chill that had nothing to do with the night air ran through. Abigail woke to the sound of distant hoofbeats and men's voices calling to one another across the ranch yard. Sunlight streamed through windows she had forgotten to cover, illuminating dust motes that danced in golden shafts. For a moment, disorientation gripped her. This wasn't her narrow room in the Boston boarding house, nor the abandoned Sullivan homestead. Then memory returned. She was at the Circle M ranch, employed as housekeeper to the enigmatic Caleb Morgan, hiding from a man who had lured her west under false pretenses. Rising quickly, she washed and dressed in her second-best dress, a serviceable navy blue, with white piping at the collar and cuffs. Today she would begin to earn her keep, to establish herself in this strange new life that was so far from what she had planned. The unknown rider she had glimpsed last night lingered in her thoughts, but in the bright light of morning the fears seemed less substantial. Downstairs the kitchen was empty save for a pot of coffee keeping warm on the stove, and a covered plate that proved to contain biscuits and bacon, likely the work of the ranch cook. A note in a firm masculine hand informed her that Caleb had ridden out at dawn to check the herd but would return by midday, and that Becca was in the stables and would be available to show her around when she was ready. Abigail ate quickly, then set about assessing the state of the household. The kitchen, while cluttered, was well equipped with modern conveniences: a large cast-iron stove, a proper sink with a pump that delivered cold water, and plenty of sturdy cookware. The pantry was reasonably well stocked with staples, though, organized with what appeared to be a man's practical disregard for efficiency. Moving through the house room by room, Abigail made mental notes. The dining room needed dusting and polishing, but was otherwise in good order. The parlor had clearly seen little use, furniture draped with sheets, books on shelves thick with dust, a piano closed and silent in the corner. Upstairs, beyond her own rooms, she found Becca's bedroom, a cheerful chaos of clothing, books, and oddly, small carved wooden horses scattered across every surface, and what she presumed was Caleb's room, the door firmly closed. The final door on the upper floor opened to reveal a room that stopped her in her tracks. Unlike the functional, somewhat neglected spaces in the rest of the house, this room had been meticulously preserved. Lace curtains hung at the windows, a vase of dried flowers stood on the dresser, and a woman's shawl was draped across the foot of the bed, as if its owner had just stepped out for a moment. The air held the faint scent of lavender and beeswax. "That was my mother's room," came Becca's voice from behind her. "Caleb never changed a thing after she died." Abigail turned to find the girl standing in the doorway, her usual exuberance subdued. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to intrude." "It's all right," Becca said, stepping into the room. "I come in here sometimes when I want to feel close to her. I don't really remember her. I was only 2 when she died, but Caleb tells me stories." Abigail's heart ached for the girl who had grown up without a mother, and for the brother who had preserved this shrine to a memory. He must have loved her very much. "Our whole family did," Becca said simply. "Father never remarried, and Caleb, well, I sometimes think he's afraid to love anyone that much again." The observation, coming from one so young, held a wisdom that caught Abigail by surprise. "What makes you say that?" Becca traced the pattern on the bedspread with her fingertip. "Because of what happened with Elizabeth, I suppose. And because of how he is, always taking care of everyone else, but never letting anyone close enough to take care of him." This mention of Elizabeth, the second time Becca had referenced Caleb's former fiancée, piqued Abigail's curiosity. "What exactly happened with Elizabeth? You mentioned last night that they were engaged." Becca hesitated, clearly weighing how much to share. "It's not really my story to tell, but everyone in the county knows the basics. They were engaged to be married, but then father died suddenly and left the ranch in debt. Caleb had to work day and night to keep it afloat and take care of me. Elizabeth's father, he owned the bank. He wanted Caleb to sell the ranch, take a job in town, be the kind of husband he thought his daughter deserved." She shrugged. Caleb refused, and Mr. Hayward made it clear the engagement was over. "That's terrible," Abigail said, imagining the young Caleb faced with such an impossible choice. Did Elizabeth have no say in the matter? "She could have defied her father, I suppose," Becca said, "but she didn't. She married a lawyer from Denver 6 months later." Her expression brightened suddenly. "Come on, I'll show you the rest of the ranch." Caleb said, "I'm to be your guide today." As they left the preserved bedroom, Abigail found herself glancing back at the silent shrine to the past. How many ghosts haunted Caleb Morgan? The mother he had lost as a young man, the father whose death had thrust responsibility onto his shoulders, the fiancé who had chosen security over love. All these absences had shaped him into the man he was now. Becca proved to be an enthusiastic tour guide, leading Abigail through the outbuildings, introducing her to the cook, a grizzled man named Hank who ruled the cookhouse with an iron spatula, and proudly showing off her favorite horses. And M was larger and more prosperous than Abigail had initially realized, with over 20 permanent ranch hands and additional workers hired seasonally for roundups and cattle drives. Caleb built most of this himself after father died, Becca explained, as they walked from the stables toward a rise that overlooked the vast pastures where cattle grazed. The original ranch was less than half this size. He worked himself half to death those first few years, up before dawn, out until long after dark, taking any job that would bring in extra money. "It must have been hard on you both," Abigail observed. Becca nodded. "I barely saw him some days. Mrs. Jenkins practically raised me while Caleb was building the ranch. That's why he was so desperate when she left. Not just because the house was falling apart, but because—" She trailed off, looking embarrassed. "Because what?" "Because he worries about me not having a woman's influence," Becca admitted. "He thinks I'm too wild, too interested in ranch work and not enough in feminine pursuits, as he calls them." She rolled her eyes with the exaggerated disdain of youth, as if knowing which fork to use at dinner will be more useful than knowing how to break a horse or mend a fence. Abigail laughed, charmed by the girl's spirit. "Perhaps there's value in knowing both." Their conversation was interrupted by the approach of several riders. Caleb was at their head, his tall figure unmistakable even at a distance. As they drew closer, Abigail noticed the grim set of his jaw and the tense posture of the men riding with him. "Something's wrong," Becca murmured, her playful demeanor instantly replaced by concern. Caleb dismounted as he reached them, handing his reins to one of the ranch hands. His expression softened slightly at the sight of his sister, but the tension remained evident in the lines around his eyes. "Is everything all right?" Abigail asked. "We found 2 of our cattle shot dead near the east boundary," Caleb said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Clean shots to the head, not the work of predators or rustlers looking for meat." "Caldwell?" Becca asked, her young face hardening with unexpected ferocity. Caleb nodded grimly. "A warning, most likely. His men were asking about Miss Winters in town this morning as well." "Me!" Abigail felt a chill despite the warm morning sun. "What were they saying?" "That Nathan Sullivan's bride-to-be is missing and possibly in danger," Caleb replied. "They're offering a reward for information on your whereabouts. Enough money to turn heads." Abigail's hand flew to her throat. "I should leave. I'm bringing trouble to your door." "You're not going anywhere," Caleb said firmly. "Caldwell's trying to flush you out, make you feel unsafe here, so you'll run straight into his hands." He glanced at his sister. "Becca, find Pete and tell him to gather the men. We need to increase patrols, especially after dark." As Becca hurried off to deliver the message, Caleb's focus returned to Abigail. His blue eyes searched her face. "Are you all right? I know this must be frightening." The concern in his voice touched her. "I'm more angry than frightened," she admitted. "To think that I traveled all this way based on lies, that someone would go to such lengths to use me for their own gain." "Men like Caldwell see people as tools to be used and discarded," Caleb said bitterly. "He's done it to half the county over the years, cheated widows out of their land, intimidated small ranchers into selling for a fraction of what their property was worth." "Why doesn't the law stop him?" Abigail asked. Caleb's mouth twisted in a humorless smile. Caldwell's careful. He operates just inside the law, or at least in ways that are difficult to prove in court, and he has friends in Helena, politicians who benefit from his generosity. They began walking back toward the house, Caleb shortening his long stride, to match hers. Despite the grave news, Abigail found herself acutely aware of his presence beside her, the subtle scent of leather and horses that clung to him, the way the sun brought out auburn highlights in his dark hair. "How did you sleep?" he asked, the mundane question an obvious attempt to change the subject to something less troubling. "Well enough," Abigail replied, deciding not to mention the rider she had glimpsed from her window. "The rooms are lovely. Once I've given them a proper cleaning, they'll be quite comfortable." "I hope you'll make any changes you think necessary to feel at home," Caleb said. "Mrs. Jenkins was particular about having things just so. Moved the furniture 3 times before she was satisfied with the arrangement." "Did she work for your family long?" "Nearly 20 years. She came when my mother was expecting Becca and stayed on after." He trailed off, then continued more briskly. "She became like family. Her daughter married a rancher over in Bitterroot Valley. When the baby came early and there were complications, Mrs. Jenkins had to go help. We didn't expect her to be gone permanently, but her daughter needs her more than we do." Abigail heard the unspoken loss in his words. Another person who had left, another absence to be endured. "Family should come first," she said gently. "I'm sure she misses you and Becca." She writes," Caleb acknowledged. "Sends recipes Becca never attempts, and advice I rarely follow." A faint smile touched his lips. "She'd approve of you, I think. She always said the house needed a firm hand and a practical mind." The compliment, indirect as it was, warmed Abigail unexpectedly. "I'll do my best to live up to her standards." They had reached the house, and Caleb paused at the bottom of the porch steps. "I need to meet with the men, make arrangements for additional security. Will you be all right here with Becca?" "Of course," Abigail assured him. "I have plenty to keep me occupied. The house won't clean itself." Caleb nodded, seemingly relieved by her practical attitude. "I'll have one of the men stay close to the house just in case. If you need anything, Hank will be in the cookhouse until dinner." As he turned to go, Abigail impulsively reached out to touch his arm. "Mr. Moore, Caleb, thank you for everything you're doing to protect me. I know I've brought trouble to your door, and I'm grateful for your kindness." Something flickered in his eyes, surprise perhaps, at the contact or the sincerity in her voice. "You don't need to thank me," he said quietly. "It's what any decent man would do." But as he strode away toward the bunkhouse, Abigail thought that Caleb Morgan was far from any decent man. In less than 2 days, he had rescued her from an abandoned homestead, offered her employment and protection, and now stood between her and a dangerous adversary. Such actions went beyond common decency into something rarer and more valuable. The rest of the day passed in a flurry of activity as Abigail threw herself into the task of restoring order to the Morgan household. She swept and dusted the downstairs rooms, reorganized the pantry according to a more logical system, and took inventory of the linens, making note of those that needed mending or replacing. The physical labor was almost a relief. It kept her hands busy and her mind occupied with practical concerns rather than dwelling on Vernon Caldwell's escalating threats. Becca drifted in and out, occasionally helping, but more often sharing. Stories of the ranch's history or her latest adventures with her beloved horses. By late afternoon, Abigail had managed to transform the kitchen and dining room from cluttered disarray into ordered spaces that would function more efficiently for meal preparation and service. "It looks different already," Becca observed as she perched on a kitchen stool, watching Abigail knead dough for the evening bread. "Caleb will be impressed." "I hope so," Abigail said, surprised by how much she wanted his approval. "I thought we might have a proper dinner tonight. Roast chicken, potatoes, green beans, and fresh bread. Hank said he'd bring over whatever I needed from the cookhouse stores. Caleb loves chicken, Becca offered, and apple pie, though I've never managed to make one that didn't collapse when you cut into it. Then we'll have apple pie for dessert, Abigail decided. There are plenty of apples in the root cellar, and I saw lard and flour in the pantry. The simple domestic planning felt strangely comforting, a small piece of normalcy in a situation that was anything but normal. As she worked, Abigail found herself imagining more such evenings, cooking meals for the Morgan household, bringing order to the home, becoming part of the rhythm of ranch life. But such thoughts were dangerous. This was a temporary arrangement, a safe harbor until the threat from Vernon Caldwell could be resolved. Wasn't it? The question lingered as she prepared dinner, as she set the table with the Morgan family's good china, unearthed from a sideboard and carefully washed. And as she arranged wildflowers, Becca had gathered in a crystal vase that had clearly sat unused for years. When Caleb returned to the house shortly before sunset, the transformation stopped him in his tracks. The dining room glowed with lamplight, the table was properly set, and the scent of roasting chicken and baking bread filled the air. But it was the flowers that captured his attention. Simple purple asters and golden black-eyed Susans arranged, with sprigs of prairie grass in a vase that Abigail later learned had belonged to his mother. "You've been busy," he said, his voice carefully neutral, though his eyes betrayed his surprise. "Just making a start," Abigail replied. "There's still plenty to do." Dinner that night was a more formal affair than the previous evening's meal. Abigail had coaxed Becca into a clean dress and convinced her to pin up her wild hair, and she noted with approval that Caleb had changed from his work clothes into a clean shirt and polished boots. "This is delicious," Caleb said after his first bite of chicken. "I don't think we've had a meal like this since Christmas, when Mrs. Jenkins was still here. Abigail's going to teach me to make apple pie that doesn't collapse," Becca announced around a mouthful of potatoes, and she let me help set the table with the good dishes. Did she now? Caleb glanced at Abigail with a raised eyebrow. Mrs. Jenkins only allowed the good china on holidays and special occasions. "Every day is a special occasion when you have people to share it with," Abigail said, then felt heat rise in her cheeks at how presumptuous the statement might sound. "That's what my mother always said anyway." "A wise woman," Caleb observed. "Is she still living?" Abigail shook her head. "She died 5 years ago. Influenza. My father passed when I was 12, so after Mother died I was on my own." "No brothers or sisters?" Becca asked. "None," Abigail said. "I worked at Lowell Mills, lived in company housing until the mill closed. After that, I took whatever work I could find: seamstress, shop girl, laundress." She hesitated, then added, "When I saw the advertisement for a mail-order bride, it seemed like a chance for something more stable." "Nathan Sullivan's advertisement," Caleb said, his expression darkening. "Or rather, Caldwell's advertisement in Sullivan's name." "Yes." Abigail looked down at her plate. "I should have been more cautious, I suppose, but the letters seemed so genuine. He, whoever was writing them, asked about my interests, my hopes for the future. He shared stories about life on the ranch, about the community, even sent pressed wildflowers once." She shook her head at her own naivety. "I wanted to believe so badly that I ignored any signs that might have warned me." "It's not your fault," Caleb said firmly. "Caldwell is a practiced deceiver. He's fooled men with far more experience of the world than you." "Have there been any more signs of his men today?" Abigail asked, changing the subject from her own gullibility. Caleb hesitated, glancing at Becca. "Perhaps we should discuss this after dinner." "I'm not a child, Caleb," Becca protested. "I know what's happening. Whiskey Pete already told me." They found tracks from at least 4 riders along the east ridge. Caleb shot an exasperated look toward the cookhouse, where his foreman was presumably having his own dinner. "Pete talks too much." He sighed. "Yes, we found tracks. They're watching the ranch, likely trying to determine if you're here and, if so, where you're staying." "What do we do?" Abigail asked, fear coiling in her stomach despite the warmth of the dining room. "We remain vigilant," Caleb replied. "I've sent a man to speak with Sheriff Mason, explain the situation more fully. In the meantime, I'd like you and Becca to stay close to the house." "But the fall fair is next week," Becca objected. "I'm supposed to be exercising Tempest every day for the ladies' riding competition." "You can exercise her in the corral, where the men can keep an eye on you," Caleb said in a tone that brooked no argument. His gaze returned to Abigail. "I know this restriction is difficult, but it's for your safety. Caldwell's men would think nothing of grabbing you if they caught you alone." Abigail nodded, understanding the necessity, even as she chafed at the limitation. She had come west, seeking freedom and a new start, only to find herself effectively a prisoner, albeit in a comfortable and friendly prison. After dinner, Becca excused herself to check on her horse before bedtime, leaving Abigail and Caleb alone at the table. An awkward silence fell between them, broken only by the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. "The house looks different already," Caleb finally said. "You've accomplished more in one day than Becca and I managed in 3 months." "It just needed a woman's touch," Abigail replied, then immediately regretted the phrasing when she saw something like pain flicker across Caleb's features. "That is someone who knows where things belong and how to organize a household." "No, you're right," Caleb said. "It needed a woman's touch. This house hasn't felt like a real home since my mother died. Even with Mrs. Jenkins here, it was more of a functioning space than a home." The admission seemed to cost him something, as if acknowledging the emptiness of his home was tantamount to admitting a personal failure. Abigail's heart ached for him, this strong, solitary man who had sacrificed his own happiness to preserve his family legacy and care for his sister. "Tell me about your mother," she said gently. "Becca showed me her room today." Caleb looked surprised. "She did. She rarely takes anyone in there." He was silent for a moment, then continued, "My mother was extraordinary. Beautiful, of course, but more than that. She had a way of making everyone around her feel valued. She could calm my father's temper with a touch, make strangers feel like old friends within minutes of meeting them." "She sounds wonderful," Abigail said, touched by the warmth in his voice. "She was. She made this place shine." His eyes moved to the wildflowers on the table. She always had flowers in the house, even in winter, dried arrangements, pine boughs, whatever she could find. Said a house without flowers was just walls and a roof. "A wise woman," Abigail echoed his earlier comment about her own mother. "She would have liked you," Caleb said unexpectedly. "Your practicality, your resilience." The compliment warmed Abigail more than it should have. And would she have approved of you hiring a mail-order bride who never quite made it to the altar as your housekeeper? A ghost of a smile touched Caleb's lips. She had an unusual definition of respectability. She cared more about character than circumstances. The smile faded. "Unlike some in these parts." Abigail sensed he was thinking of Elizabeth Hayward and her father, of the engagement broken when circumstances forced a choice between love and security. "Becca mentioned your former fiancé," she said carefully. "It seems you had to make an impossible choice." Caleb's expression closed like a shutter over a window. "Becca talks too much, like Pete." He stood abruptly. "It's getting late and I have an early start tomorrow." "Of course," Abigail said, regretting her intrusion into what was clearly still a painful subject. "I'll clear the table." "Leave it," Caleb said, his voice gentler. "You've done more than enough today. Rest. Tomorrow will bring its own challenges." He was halfway to the door when he paused and turned back. "Miss Winters, Abigail, thank you for what you've done here today. Not just the cleaning and the cooking, but the flowers, the way you've been with Becca. It means a great deal." Before she could respond, he was gone, his footsteps echoing down the hallway toward his study at the back of the house. Abigail remained at the table, oddly moved by his brief expression of gratitude. There had been real emotion in his voice, perhaps the first crack in the careful reserve he maintained. As she finally rose to clear the dishes, despite his instruction to leave them, Abigail found herself wondering about the man whose home she had begun to restore. What would it take to restore Caleb Morgan himself? To heal the wounds left by loss and betrayal, to bring light back into those storm-blue eyes? And why did she care so much after knowing him for only 2 days? Later that night, as Abigail prepared for bed, she was drawn once again to the window of her room. The night was cloudy, the moon only occasionally breaking through to cast silver. Light over the ranch yard, she could make out the silhouettes of Caleb's men patrolling the property, their rifles visible even at a distance. Movement near the stables caught her eye, a tall figure she recognized instantly as Caleb. He stood watching the eastern boundary of the property, his posture alert and wary. Even from this distance, she could sense the tension in him, the readiness to defend what was his. As she watched, Becca emerged from the house and approached her brother. They stood together for a moment, their silhouettes forming a poignant tableau against the night sky. The man who had sacrificed his youth to preserve their home, and the girl who had grown up in the shadow of that sacrifice. Abigail stepped back from the window, feeling suddenly like an intruder on a private moment. She had been at Circle M for barely 2 days, yet already she felt drawn into the orbit of this family, their struggles, their sorrows, their quiet strength. The position of housekeeper was supposed to be temporary, a safe harbor until the threat from Vernon Caldwell could be resolved. But as she slipped beneath the quilts on her bed, Abigail found herself wondering what it would be like to belong here permanently, to be part of the Morgan family, not as an employee, but as something more. The thought should have alarmed her. She had come west seeking a husband, yes, but not a man as complex and guarded as Caleb Morgan, a man still haunted by the ghosts of his past. Yet as sleep finally claimed her, it was Caleb's face she saw, not as he had been at dinner, controlled and distant, but as he had looked when he first saw the flowers on the table. For just a moment, the shadows had lifted from his eyes, revealing a glimpse of the man he might have been in a kinder world. A man capable of love, of joy, of the kind of happiness that had been denied him for too long, a man worth fighting for. The thought followed Abigail into dreams, where she stood beside Caleb on the porch of a home filled with flowers and laughter, where the shadows no longer haunted his eyes, and where Vernon Caldwell and his threats were nothing but distant memories. The week that followed Abigail's arrival at Circle M Ranch settled into an unexpected rhythm, as if the household had been waiting for her presence to find its proper tempo. Each morning she rose before dawn to prepare breakfast for Caleb before he rode out to check the herds. Each evening she ensured a proper dinner awaited his return, the kind of home-cooked meals that had been absent from the Morgan table for too long. Between these domestic bookends, she transformed the ranch house room by room, bringing order and warmth to spaces that had languished in neglect. By the 5th day, even the parlor, previously a forgotten room draped in dust sheets, had been restored to its former glory. Abigail had uncovered the piano, polished its mahogany case to a warm glow, and arranged Becca's books on nearby shelves. Fresh curtains hung at the windows, sewn from fabric she had found in a trunk in the attic, and a vase of wildflowers brightened the mantel. "I haven't seen this room look so welcoming since Mother was alive," Caleb said that evening, standing in the doorway with an expression that mingled surprise and something deeper, more vulnerable. "You've worked miracles." "Hardly miracles," Abigail replied, though his praise warmed her. "Just soap, water, and determination." In truth, she had found satisfaction in the work that went beyond mere duty. Each room she restored felt like reclaiming a piece of the Morgan family's history, bringing light back into corners that had been shadowed by grief and absence. There was purpose in such work, purpose and meaning that had been missing from her life in Boston. Becca had proven an enthusiastic, if occasionally distracted, assistant. The girl's energy was boundless, though her attention tended to wander, whenever conversation turned to horses or the upcoming fall fair. Under Abigail's gentle guidance, however, she had begun to take pride in certain domestic tasks, particularly baking, where her scientific curiosity found outlet in understanding the chemistry behind successful pastry. "You've been good for her," Caleb observed one afternoon, finding Abigail and Becca in the kitchen, surrounded by flour and the scent of cinnamon as they experimented with apple pie recipes. "She needs this, needs to learn there's value in creating a home, not just in breaking horses." "She's a remarkable young woman," Abigail replied, watching Becca carefully crimp the edges of a pie crust with the serious concentration of a surgeon. "You've raised her well." A shadow crossed Caleb's face. "I've done my best, but a brother isn't a mother. There are things she should have learned years ago, things about being a woman that I couldn't teach her." The vulnerability in his admission touched Abigail deeply. This strong, capable man carried the weight of believing he had somehow failed his sister by not being able to replace the mother they had lost. "Children need love and security above all," she said gently. "You've given her both. The rest, the feminine graces, those can be learned. The foundation you've built cannot." Something flickered in Caleb's eyes, gratitude perhaps, or surprise at being understood so completely. But before he could respond, one of the ranch hands appeared at the kitchen door with news that drew him away. More cattle found dead along the eastern boundary, another warning from Vernon Caldwell. For despite the domestic tranquility developing within the house, danger continued to circle the ranch like wolves around a campfire. Riders had been spotted watching the property from the ridgeline. Tracks were found near the creek that supplied the ranch's water. Twice, Caleb had intercepted men claiming to be lost travelers who had somehow wandered onto Circle M land despite its clear boundary markers. "He's testing our defenses," Caleb explained grimly after one such encounter. "Looking for weaknesses, trying to determine where you're staying and how well guarded you are." The threat cast a shadow over Abigail's growing contentment at Circle M. Each night, as she prepared for bed, she found herself drawn to the window, scanning the darkness for movement, listening for hoofbeats that might signal Caldwell's men approaching. And each night, she saw Caleb or his trusted hands patrolling the property, keeping watch over the household that had become her temporary haven. Temporary. The word troubled her more with each passing day. What had begun as a pragmatic arrangement, shelter and protection in exchange for domestic service, had evolved into something she was increasingly reluctant to surrender. She had come to care deeply for Becca, whose wild spirit and generous heart reminded Abigail of the sister she had always wished for. And Caleb. Caleb was becoming a complication she had not anticipated. She found herself watching him when he wasn't aware, noting the gentleness with which he treated his horses, the patience he showed when teaching Becca a new skill, the rare smile that transformed his serious face when something genuinely amused him. Each glimpse revealed another facet of a man far more complex than the stoic rancher he presented to the world. "You're staring again," Becca observed with adolescent directness as they worked in the garden one morning, weeding the beds Abigail had discovered beneath years of neglect. "At Caleb, I mean." You do that a lot." Heat rushed to Abigail's cheeks. "I'm sure I don't know what you mean." Becca rolled her eyes, utterly unconvinced. "You watch him like you're trying to solve a puzzle, and he watches you too, when you're not looking." This revelation startled Abigail enough that she pulled up a marigold instead of the weed beside it. "Don't be ridiculous," she said, more sharply than intended. "Your brother employed me to restore order to this household, nothing more." "If you say so," Becca replied with exaggerated innocence, "but I've known Caleb my whole life, and I've never seen him bring flowers home before." "Flowers?" Abigail echoed, confused. "The wild irises on your windowsill," Becca said. "I didn't gather those, and they didn't walk there on their own. Caleb must have picked them on his morning ride and put them in your room while you were helping Hank inventory the root cellar." Abigail had assumed the delicate purple blooms were Becca's doing, another of the girl's impulsive gestures of friendship. The idea that Caleb had gathered them specifically for her had entered her room to place them where she would see them upon returning. The thought sent a flutter of something warm and dangerous through her chest. "I'm sure he was just being kind," she managed, focusing intently on separating a stubborn dandelion from the hard-packed soil. "After all, I've been working very hard." Becca hummed skeptically. "That must be it. The same reason he carved that new handle for your favorite broom when the old one split, and built that shelf in your sitting room for your books, and started wearing his good shirt to dinner." She sat back on her heels, fixing Abigail with a penetrating gaze. Pure kindness. Abigail had no ready response. She had noticed these gestures, of course, had been touched by the thoughtfulness behind them, but had attributed them to Caleb's natural consideration, rather than any particular regard for her personally. Could Becca be right? Could this reserved, haunted man be developing feelings for his housekeeper? And if so, what was she to do about the answering feelings taking root in her own heart? Such questions were still troubling her that evening as she prepared dinner. A hearty stew simmering on the stove, fresh bread cooling on the sideboard. She had just begun to set the table when the sound of riders approaching at speed drew her. And to the window, Caleb and two of his men galloped into the yard, their horses lathered with sweat, their expressions grim. Becca burst into the kitchen moments later, her face alight with excitement and trepidation. "Something's happened. Pete says there was a confrontation at the north boundary. Shots were fired." Abigail's heart seized with fear. "Was anyone hurt? Is Caleb—" "I'm fine," came Caleb's voice from the doorway. He stood there removing his gloves, his expression dark but composed. A streak of dirt marked one cheekbone, and his shirt was torn at the shoulder, but he appeared otherwise unharmed. "Caldwell's men tried to drive off some of our cattle. We intercepted them." Relief made Abigail's knees weak. "Thank God you're all right." "What happened?" Becca demanded, practically vibrating with tension. Caleb sighed, moving to the sink to wash trail dust from his hands and face. "4 of Caldwell's men cutting fences and driving a dozen head of our prime stock towards Sullivan's old place. We caught them in the act. There was an exchange of gunfire, but they retreated when they realized they were outmanned." "Did you get the cattle back?" Becca asked. "We did." Caleb dried his hands on a towel, his movements betraying a weariness that concerned Abigail. "But this wasn't about cattle. Caldwell's men could have taken animals from any of a dozen smaller spreads with less security. This was a message, a demonstration that he can reach us, harm our interests." "Harm you," Abigail thought with a sick feeling. "Because of me. Because I'm here." "What will he try next?" she asked quietly. Caleb's eyes met hers, and she saw both determination and regret in their blue depths. "Something more direct, I suspect. Sheriff Mason stopped by the north pasture. While we were rounding up the scattered cattle, Caldwell's been telling people in town that you're being held at Circle M against your will." "That's absurd," Becca exclaimed. "Abigail chose to come here. Caldwell claims we're keeping her isolated, preventing her from fulfilling her contractual obligation to marry Nathan Sullivan's heir." Caleb's mouth twisted in disgust. "He's positioning himself as the concerned executor of Sullivan's estate, duty-bound to protect the interests of Sullivan's intended bride." The calculated cruelty of the strategy left Abigail breathless. Not only was Caldwell continuing his deception about Nathan Sullivan, but he was now painting Caleb as her captor rather than her protector. "What can we do?" "Mason suggested you make an appearance in town, be seen interacting freely with others. Make it clear you're here by choice," Caleb said. "The full fair is tomorrow. Everyone in the county will be there. It would be the perfect opportunity to counter Caldwell's narrative." "But you said it wasn't safe for me to leave the ranch," Abigail reminded him. "It's less safe now to keep you isolated," Caleb replied grimly. "Caldwell's laying groundwork for something. Perhaps an attempt to have you removed by legal means, claiming unlawful detention. If enough people believe his story, he might convince a judge to issue an order." The thought of being legally compelled to place herself in Caldwell's power sent a chill through Abigail. "Then we'll go to the fair," she said with more confidence than she felt. "All of us." Relief flickered across Caleb's face. "I'll have the men prepared. We'll travel in force. Make it clear to Caldwell that any attempt to separate you from our party will be met with resistance." "Does this mean I can still compete in the ladies' riding exhibition?" Becca asked hopefully. Caleb's expression softened as he looked at his sister. "Yes, but you'll have Pete or Jake with you at all times, even in the competitors' area. No wandering off, no matter what." The girl's whoop of excitement cut through the tension, reminding them all that, despite the danger, life continued with its small joys and ordinary pleasures. Dinner that night was a subdued affair, however, with Caleb lost in thought and Abigail preoccupied with the risks of the coming day. As they finished the meal, Caleb cleared his throat. "Abigail, there's something else we should discuss, something that might help secure your position." She looked up from her plate, noting the unusual tension in his posture. "What is it?" Caleb hesitated, uncharacteristically uncertain. "Mason mentioned that if you had a more permanent connection to Circle M, it would be harder for Caldwell to press any claim on you through Sullivan's estate." "What kind of permanent connection?" Abigail asked, though something in his tone made her heart beat faster. "A contract," Caleb said carefully. "Not as housekeeper, but as governess to Becca. A formal arrangement with a term of years, filed with the county clerk. It would establish legally that you have obligations here that precede any claim Caldwell might make." "Governess?" Becca protested. "I don't need a governess. I'm 16. "The title is a formality," Caleb explained with forced patience. "The important part is creating a legal barrier between Abigail and Caldwell's schemes." Abigail considered the proposal. A formal contract would indeed strengthen her position, provide legal protection beyond the informal arrangement they currently had. Yet something about the practical, emotionless nature of Caleb's suggestion disappointed her in a way she wasn't prepared to examine too closely. "That seems sensible," she said finally. "I'd be happy to sign such a contract." Caleb nodded, though something like disappointment flickered in his eyes as well. "Good. I'll have the papers drawn up when we're in town tomorrow." The evening concluded shortly thereafter, with Becca excusing herself to prepare her riding clothes for the competition, and Caleb retreating to his study to review security arrangements for their trip to town. Left alone, Abigail methodically cleared the table and washed the dishes, her mind turning over the coming confrontation and what it might mean for her future. Later, as she prepared for bed, a soft knock at her sitting room door startled her. She opened it to find Caleb standing in the hallway, his expression troubled. "I'm sorry to disturb you," he said, "but there's something I need to say before tomorrow." Abigail stepped back, gesturing for him to enter. He did so with obvious reluctance, remaining near the door as if preparing for a quick retreat. In the lamplight, she could see the strain of the past week etched in the lines around his eyes, the tension in his shoulders. "What is it?" she asked gently. Caleb ran a hand through his hair, a rare gesture of agitation from a man who normally kept his emotions so carefully controlled. "I want you to know that you're under no obligation to remain at Circle M if you don't wish to. The contract I mentioned, it's only if you genuinely want to stay. If you'd prefer to return east or seek a position elsewhere, I'll ensure you have the means to do so safely." The offer took Abigail by surprise. "Do you want me to leave?" "No," Caleb said quickly, too quickly. He seemed to realize this and continued more measured. "That is, your presence has been beneficial to the household, to Becca." He paused, then added more softly, "to me." The admission hung in the air between them, more revealing in its simplicity than a more flowery declaration might have been. This was a man unaccustomed to expressing personal desires, to acknowledging needs beyond the practical requirements of running his ranch and caring for his sister. "I don't want to leave," Abigail said, matching his honesty with her own. "I've found something here that I didn't expect." "What have you found?" Caleb asked, his voice low. Abigail hesitated, searching for words that wouldn't reveal too much of her growing feelings, yet would still convey the truth. "Purpose," she said finally. "Connection. A sense of belonging that I haven't felt since my mother died." She took a breath, then added, "I came west seeking security, but I think I may have found a home instead." Something in Caleb's expression shifted, the guardedness giving way to a vulnerability that caught at Abigail's heart. "Circle M could be your home," he said quietly, "if you wanted it to be." The moment stretched between them, heavy with unspoken possibilities. Abigail was acutely aware of his presence in the small room, the scent of leather and pine that clung to him, the breadth of his shoulders in the lamplight, the intensity in his blue eyes as they held hers. "Caleb," she began, though she wasn't sure what she intended to say. He took a step toward her, then stopped himself, the careful restraint returning to his features. "It's late. You should rest. Tomorrow will be challenging." The withdrawal stung more than it should have. "Yes, of course," Abigail said, forcing a calm she didn't feel. "Good night, Caleb." He nodded, already moving toward the door. "Good night, Abigail." After he left, Abigail stood motionless in the center of the room, her thoughts in turmoil. What had just happened? Had Caleb Morgan, the stoic rancher who kept everyone at a careful distance, almost revealed feelings for her? And had she almost welcomed them? The realization both thrilled and terrified her. She had come to Montana seeking a marriage of convenience with Nathan Sullivan, a practical arrangement between strangers that might, with time, grow into something like affection. What she felt for Caleb after less than 2 weeks in his home was already deeper, more complex than anything she had anticipated feeling for Sullivan. But Caleb was not Nathan Sullivan. He was a man shaped by loss and responsibility, a man who had sacrificed his own happiness to preserve his family legacy. Even if he did have feelings for her, would he allow himself to act on them? Or would the ghosts of his past, his mother, his father, Elizabeth Hayward, continue to stand between him and any chance at happiness? Sleep was elusive that night as Abigail's mind circled these questions. When she finally drifted off near dawn, her dreams were a confusing blend of images. Vernon Caldwell's faceless men pursuing her through endless fields. Caleb standing on The porch of Circle M, watching her ride away, a wedding where the groom kept changing from Sullivan to Caldwell to Caleb, and through it all, the persistent sense that something vital hung in the balance, something that would be decided in the confrontation to come. Morning arrived with the crisp clarity of early autumn, the sky a perfect blue unmarred by clouds. Abigail dressed with particular care in her best dress, a forest green poplin with black piping that she had refreshed with new lace at the collar and cuffs. Her honey blonde hair she arranged in a simple but elegant knot at the nape of her neck, secured with tortoiseshell combs that had belonged to her mother. The household was in a state of controlled chaos as preparations for the fair continued. Becca flitted about in a state of nervous excitement, her riding habit pressed and ready, her constant chatter betraying her anticipation of the competition. Caleb moved through the house, issuing instructions to his men, checking weapons, reviewing plans with the precision of a military commander preparing for battle. And in many ways, Abigail reflected as she packed a basket of food for their day in town. It was a battle they were heading into, a confrontation not just with Vernon Caldwell, but with the false narrative he had constructed about her situation. "You look lovely," Caleb said, finding her in the kitchen. He had dressed for town as well, in a clean black frock coat and crisp white shirt, his dark hair neatly combed, his beard trimmed. The formal attire transformed him from rugged rancher to something approaching a gentleman, though the strength in his shoulders and the weathered tan of his face still marked him as a man of the frontier. "Thank you," Abigail replied, feeling oddly shy under his direct gaze. "Is everything ready?" Caleb nodded. "The wagon is prepared. 8 of my best men will ride with us, 4 ahead, 4 behind. Pete will stay close to Becca during the competition, and Jake will remain with you at all times." "And you?" Abigail asked. "Where will you be?" A muscle tightened in Caleb's jaw. "Dealing with Caldwell. Mason will be at the fair, but his authority only extends so far. This ends today, one way or another." Anxiety knotted in Abigail's stomach. "Please be careful. Caldwell has already shown he's willing to resort to violence." "So am I," Caleb said quietly, "when what matters to me is threatened." The simplicity of the statement and all it implied hung between them as Becca burst into the kitchen, practically vibrating with excitement in her navy riding habit. "Are we ready? Tempest is already loaded in the wagon. Jake says we should leave now if I'm going to have time to warm up before the competition." The journey to town passed without incident, though Abigail was acutely aware of the armed men surrounding their wagon, their vigilant gazes scanning the landscape for signs of trouble. Becca chattered the entire way, her nervous excitement spilling over into stories about previous fairs, competitions won and lost, the merits of various horses she had ridden over the years. Abigail welcomed the distraction, though she noted that Caleb remained largely silent, his attention focused on the road ahead and the potential dangers it might hold. Only once did he join the conversation, correcting Becca's recollection of the disastrous fair 3 years prior when her pony had broken free and disrupted the pie judging. It wasn't Mrs. Holloway's prize-winning apple pie that ended up on Reverend Clark's head, he said with the ghost of a smile. It was Martha Simmons' gooseberry. The Reverend's beard was stained purple for a week. Becca's peal of laughter at the memory lightened the mood briefly, but as they approached the outskirts of town, tension returned. The main street was already crowded with wagons and riders heading toward the fairgrounds on the eastern edge of the settlement. Flags and bunting decorated the storefronts, and the distant sound of a brass band playing Buffalo Gals drifted on the breeze. "Stay close," Caleb instructed as they joined the flow of traffic. "We'll proceed directly to the fairgrounds. Get." Becca registered for her competition, then make a point of being seen together throughout the day. The fairgrounds were a swirl of color and activity. canvas tents housing exhibits of preserves and needlework, corrals where livestock was being judged, a circular track where the riding competitions would take place. Children darted between adults, clutching candy sticks and paper windmills. The air was rich with the scent of frying dough, roasting meat, and the inevitable dust kicked up by hundreds of boots. As their party made its way through the crowd, Abigail became aware of the attention they were attracting. Conversations paused as they passed, heads turned to watch their progress, whispers followed in their wake. Clearly, Vernon Caldwell's story had spread throughout the community. "Ignore them," Caleb murmured, his hand coming to rest at the small of her back as he guided her through a particularly dense knot of onlookers. "We'll make our way to Mason first. Establish your presence officially." Sheriff Mason was stationed near the judge's tent, his silver star catching the sunlight as he conversed with several town elders. His eyes widened slightly at the sight of their approach, not at their presence, Abigail realized, but at the substantial armed escort Caleb had brought with them. "Morgan," he greeted them, tipping his hat respectfully to Abigail. "Miss Winters, glad to see you could make it to our little celebration." "Sheriff," Caleb replied with a nod. "Has Caldwell shown himself yet?" Mason's expression grew guarded. "He's here. Got half a dozen of his men with him too. They're over by the refreshment tent making a point of buying drinks for anyone who'll listen to his version of events." His gaze shifted to Abigail. "You should know, Miss Winters, he's been telling folks you wrote to him before leaving Boston, agreeing to honor your arrangement with Sullivan by marrying him as Sullivan's business partner and heir." "That's a lie," Abigail said firmly, anger overcoming her usual reserve. "I never corresponded with Vernon Caldwell. Every letter I received was signed by Nathan Sullivan." "I believe you," Mason assured her, "but Caldwell's a persuasive talker, and he's got documents, letters he claims you sent, that seem to support his story." "Forgeries," Caleb said grimly. "Most likely," Mason agreed, "but they're convincing enough to sway those who don't know better." The fair hummed with festivity around them, but Abigail felt as though she stood in the eye of a storm. Children laughed as they chased one another between colorful tents, women proudly displayed quilts and preserves for judging, and men gathered in clusters to discuss cattle prices and the coming winter. Yet beneath this veneer of celebration, currents of tension swirled. "I need to speak with Caldwell directly," Abigail said, squaring her shoulders. The anger that had been building since learning of his deception crystallized into determination. "I won't hide while he spreads lies about me." Caleb's expression hardened. "Absolutely not. Caldwell is dangerous." "So am I," Abigail interrupted, surprising herself with the steel in her voice. "He's made me so. He stole my future once with his lies. I won't let him do it again." Sheriff Mason's weathered face creased in a reluctant smile. "The lady has spirit, Morgan. Might be better to confront this head-on, with witnesses present." He gestured toward the gathering of town elders nearby. "Judge Wilson is here, along with Reverend Clark and half the town council. No better audience for setting the record." Straight. Caleb looked torn between admiration for Abigail's courage and fear for her safety. "At least wait until Becca's competition is finished," he said finally. "I promised her I'd watch, and I want you somewhere public and visible when Caldwell realizes you're here." The compromise seemed reasonable. As they made their way to the riding arena, Abigail was acutely aware of the whispers that followed them, the curious and sometimes hostile glances from townspeople who had clearly heard Caldwell's version of events. Caleb's men formed a protective perimeter around them, their vigilance a silent testament to the danger they anticipated. Becca's riding exhibition was scheduled as the third event of the day. They found seats in the small wooden stands overlooking the arena just as the first competitor, a solemn-faced girl of about 14 on a chestnut mare, began her routine. The crowd applauded politely as she guided her horse through a series of figures, her posture rigid with concentration. "Becca's much better," Caleb murmured, his critical eye assessing the competition. "If she keeps her nerves under control and Tempest doesn't spook at the flags, she should place well." The casual confidence in his assessment made Abigail smile despite the tension of the day. This was the Caleb she had come to know in the quiet moments at Circle M, the devoted brother who had sacrificed so much to give his sister a secure home and the chance to pursue her passions. The man whose rare smiles transformed his face, erasing years of care in an instant. "There he is," Jake said suddenly from behind them, his voice low. 10 o'clock, by the judge's tent. Abigail followed his gaze to see a man she instantly knew must be Vernon Caldwell. Tall and expensively dressed in a tailored suit that set him apart from the more practical attire of most attendees, he cut an imposing figure. His silver hair and neatly trimmed beard gave him a distinguished appearance that belied the ruthlessness she knew lay beneath the civilized exterior. Even from this distance, she could see the calculation in his eyes as they swept the crowd, searching. For her, she realized with a chill. He was looking for her. Beside her, Caleb tensed, his hand moving instinctively to where his pistol would normally be holstered. But firearms weren't permitted within the fairgrounds, a wise precaution given the combination of competitive spirits and the whiskey flowing freely at many of the refreshment tents. "He doesn't know what you look like," Caleb said softly. "That gives us an advantage." It was true. Caldwell had been corresponding with her under Sullivan's name, but he had never seen her in person. She was just a means to an end for him, a woman whose legal status as Sullivan's intended bride could secure his claim to the ranch. A flutter of activity near the competitor's entrance drew their attention as Becca appeared, leading Tempest into position for her turn in the exhibition. The mare was a striking blood bay, her coat gleaming like polished mahogany in the autumn sunlight. Becca had braided red ribbons into her mane and tail, matching the trim on her own riding habit. "She looks so grown up," Abigail murmured, surprised by the swell of pride she felt watching the girl prepare for her moment in the spotlight. "Too grown up," Caleb replied, but there was no real complaint in his tone, only the bittersweet acknowledgement of a guardian watching his charge blossom into adulthood. As Becca's name was announced, a hush fell over the crowd. She guided Tempest into the arena with confident hands, acknowledging the judges with a poised nod before beginning her routine. From the first movement, it was clear that girl and horse were perfectly attuned to each other. Tempest responded to the slightest pressure of Becca's knee, the gentlest tug of the reins, executing each figure with a grace that made the earlier competitors seem awkward by comparison. "She's magnificent," Abigail whispered, enthralled by the display of skill and harmony. "Yes," Caleb agreed, his eyes never leaving his sister. "She's been practicing that final figure for months. If she can nail the timing." The final figure proved to be a complex series of movements requiring Tempest to execute precise pivots while maintaining an elevated trot. As horse and rider completed the maneuver flawlessly, the crowd burst into spontaneous applause. Even the judges, who had maintained stoic expressions throughout the previous exhibitions, nodded in appreciation. Caleb's face split in a rare, unreserved smile of pride. "That's my girl," he said softly, and Abigail felt her heart constrict at the naked love in his voice. As Becca guided Tempest from the arena to continued applause, Abigail caught movement from the corner of her eye. Vernon Caldwell had shifted position and was now staring directly at their party, his expression one of intense focus as his gaze moved from Caleb to Abigail and back again. A slow smile spread across his face, not one of warmth, but of a predator who has sighted prey. "He spotted us," Jake murmured from behind. "And he's not alone. His men are moving to flank the exit." Caleb nodded almost imperceptibly. "Stay close to Abigail. Pete will bring Becca to us once she's seen to Tempest." The tension in the air was palpable now, a stark contrast to the festive atmosphere surrounding them. As they made their way down from the stands, Abigail was conscious of being the center of a complex choreography, Caleb's men adjusting their positions to maintain a protective formation, Caldwell's associates moving to intercept them, curious townspeople watching the drama unfold without understanding its full significance. They had almost reached the area where riders collected their horses when Vernon Caldwell stepped directly into their path, flanked by two men whose rough appearance and watchful stance marked them as hired muscle rather than ranch hands. "Morgan," Caldwell said, his voice cultured and controlled, "I was beginning to think you weren't going to grace us with your presence today." His gaze shifted to Abigail, traveling over her with an assessment that made her skin crawl. "And this must be Miss Winters. At last we meet." The ranch hands dispersed to their duties as Caleb helped Abigail and a still drowsy Becca down from the wagon. The setting sun painted the mountains in shades of purple and gold, casting long shadows across the yard where chickens scratched contentedly, oblivious to the drama that had unfolded in town. "I'll see to the horses," Caleb said. "Becca, go inside and rest. You did splendidly today, in the competition and after." Pride and lingering concern mingled in his voice as he looked at his sister. "Did I place?" Becca asked, suddenly more alert. "With everything that happened, I never heard the results." Caleb's rare, genuine smile appeared. "First place of course. Pete collected the ribbon and prize money. They're in my coat pocket." Becca's whoop of delight pierced the evening quiet as she threw her arms around her brother's neck. "I knew Tempest could do it. Wait until Mrs. Holloway hears. She bet old Mr. Simmons a whole apple pie that I'd win." As Becca dashed inside to change out of her riding habit, Caleb turned to Abigail. "Would you walk with me a moment? There's something I need to say." Curiosity and a flicker of apprehension prompted Abigail to nod. They moved toward the garden she had begun to restore, now peaceful in the golden light of approaching sunset. The late roses she had coaxed back to health with careful pruning nodded their heavy heads in the gentle evening breeze. "I owe you an apology," Caleb began, surprising her. "I should have handled Caldwell differently. I put you and Becca in danger today because of my own stubborn pride." "You couldn't have known he would react so violently," Abigail countered, "or that Becca had those documents, which, by the way, was both incredibly reckless and astonishingly brave of her." A rueful smile touched Caleb's lips. "She's too much like me for her own good. Takes matters into her own hands when she thinks justice isn't being served." The smile faded, "But that's not the only thing I need to apologize for. Last night, when I came to your room to discuss the contract, I wasn't entirely honest with you." Abigail's heart beat faster. "What do you mean?" Caleb ran a hand through his hair, a rare gesture of uncertainty from a man who usually appeared so self-contained. "The contract was a practical solution, yes, but my motivations for suggesting it weren't entirely practical." He met her gaze directly, his blue eyes intense in the fading light. "The truth is, I can't bear the thought of you leaving Circle. Not because you're an excellent housekeeper, though you are, not because Becca adores you, though she does, but because He broke off, visibly struggling with words that didn't come easily to a man who had spent a lifetime containing his emotions, protecting himself from further loss. "Because," Abigail prompted softly, hardly daring to hope. "Because I'm falling in love with you," Caleb said finally, the words emerging with the force of a confession. "I know it's too soon. I know you came here expecting to marry another man. I know I have nothing to offer but a challenging life on a remote ranch with a headstrong teenage sister as part of the bargain. But these past 2 weeks have shown me what Circle M could be, what my life could be, with you in it. The naked vulnerability in his face took Abigail's breath away. This proud, private man was laying his heart bare before her, risking rejection after years of carefully avoiding such exposure. "Caleb," she began, her voice catching on his name. "You don't have to answer now," he said quickly. "I know this is sudden, unexpected. I just needed you to know the truth, especially after today, after seeing how quickly everything we care about can be threatened." He took a deep breath. "Take all the time you need. The contract stands regardless of your feelings toward me. Your position here is secure for as long as you wish to stay." The generosity of this offer to provide her with security while placing no expectations on her heart moved Abigail deeply. This was a man who had learned the hard lesson that love often came with conditions, with expectations that could crush the very feelings they were meant to nurture. "What if I don't need time?" she asked, taking a step toward him. "What if I already know what I want?" Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.